Now, the COVID vaccination, you cannot go a day, an hour, sometimes a minute without having conversations about them. Personally, you can have your jab if you want it. If you don't, you can have 2, 3, you can have 10. Have as many as you want. However, when it comes to your job, what do you feel about the situation where people are going to be told that if you don't have this vaccination, you can't continue in your job? The reason I ask you this is because unions are warning a social care crisis could be on the cards as 60,000 staff face losing their jobs if they don't get this vaccine. This, of course, comes at a time when there's about 100,000 vacancies in that sector. And to add to this, the UK government is set to announce mandatory vaccines for the frontline NHS workers. I mean, I laugh because I personally, I don't agree with this. You probably won't be surprised to hear that if you follow this story regularly. When it comes to the NHS, the intention is to look to introduce them from April for NHS workers in England. The deadline for care workers, of course, is later this month, the 11th. Alan, your thoughts on this?
I think it's really problematic that you have mandatory no jab, no job. I think if you want to convince about the efficacy of something and win hearts and minds, then fair enough. A large proportion of people in Britain have had their vaccinations. This idea that then you make it a mandatory imposition is ludicrous, right? On the one hand, it's going to intensify the real difficult problems we've got already, that care homes have been so terribly treated throughout lockdowns, and like with the NHS, with the backlog we've got. So it's going to intensify all those problems. And you actually increase vaccine hesitancy as it happens. And this is the problem, that there isn't an attempt to engage with the public to really win hearts and minds for those that aren't there. And what about all the people that have had COVID already that then have immunity that's much higher than the vaccination, as we've seen from many reports now? So all round, this is very problematic. And this attempt to constantly threaten and impose and nudge and then sack people is absolutely outrageous, in my opinion.
I've got to say, I agree with Alan, but there'll be people, and indeed there are people already messaging in. So Paul, for example, he's just messaging as I'm speaking, saying you should be jabbed if you want to work in the care industry. It's taking precautions for others' safety. If you're in the care industry, I mean, I guess it's different to, I don't know, say being a painter and decorator. If you're a carer, you've specifically chosen to care for people's health. Do you think, therefore, that you should have to have that vaccine if you're one of those workers?
I suppose I don't really understand why you wouldn't want to. I mean, so not that I don't understand the argument against having the vaccine from a liberty perspective, that I completely understand. But is that the reason why so many care workers feel that way? Because, you know, is it that you've decided to put your liberty before somebody else's life?
It's not just about liberty, is it? People will contact and say, well, hang on a second. A, I've had COVID, so I've got the antibodies already. B, I'm not at high risk of serious illness from COVID, so I don't want this.
But the people you're looking after are the most vulnerable in our society. So from my perspective, the fact that...
And they'll be double, triple jab.
Well, hopefully they will be, but maybe some of them have got underlying health issues or other problems that means that they can't be. So it has to be on a case-by-case basis.
So before I bring Laura in, what would you rather? If you had, let's just say, an elderly relative in a care home, would you rather them be cared for by someone that's not had the COVID vaccine or not be cared for by anyone at all? Because if you've got a staff shortage, you're not going to be cared for very well.
Well, that's a good point. 60,000 workers we're going to lose potentially if when this mandate comes in. You know, we've had a problem with the care sector for eons. So I suppose what I'm just very, very curious about is why is it that people that understand the benefits of looking after people feel very strongly about not having this vaccine, and why particularly in this sector compared to other sectors? Because it is a sector where you put others before yourself.
Well, if you're one of those people, if you're a care worker or maybe an NHS worker and you haven't had your jab, and, you know, Nikki's saying there she don't understand why you wouldn't, get in touch and tell Nikki why you wouldn't do that. Laura, your thoughts?
Well, let's go first of all to the public health case. If you have been vaccinated, you have the protection it gives you. This is a vaccine which mitigates your symptoms. It reduces your risk of severe illness. It does not stop transmission or onward infection. So everybody who's been offered a vaccine has been able to have it and have the protection it gives them. If a care worker chooses not to have the vaccine, basically they put themselves at risk and not others. So that's the first thing.
But you say about transmission.
That's not true, actually, it's like, Laura, because there was the Lancet report this week that came out and said that there's no difference in terms of contracting the vaccine from an unvaccinated or a vaccinated person. But the difference comes in that period where you are particularly kind of highly contagious is shrunk if you've had the vaccine. So there is a difference there, and that is important. The other thing to say is that if a care worker become sick, then they potentially impact the care that is given to the person that they care for because they're not available to care for them. So if they could have had a vaccine and kept themselves safe, isn't that something to consider?
I think it's still really early to be completely clear about the science. There are conflicting reports all the time about the window of infection and how much it reduces onward transmission. But if I could just continue on the public health case, we know that there's going to be a huge staff shortage. It could be 60,000. That is going to lead to a huge crisis in care homes, which is also going to put more pressure on hospitals. And then the next crisis we're going to face is the 100,000 NHS staff who are still unvaccinated. It's almost as if we're hurtling towards the unsustainable pressure
the plan
on the
B.
NHS, which is going to trigger Plan B. Basically, we're going to end up with a worse health problem by having short-staffed care homes and hospitals. So if you're taking a holistic view of how to keep care alive this winter, it shouldn't mean to sack people. Remember that a lot of those people who haven't been vaccinated will have had COVID and therefore already be immune. And things like their religious exemptions or any reasonable objections they've got are just being rode roughshod over. What's to incentivise them to stay in that industry versus any other industry where they can have bodily autonomy?
Brian in Kent, by the way, has been in touch saying these jabs absolutely must be mandatory. How hypocritical not to want to protect the people you care for and themselves from sickness.
I mean, one of the things we've seen, if you see in America, it's playing out now, and the irony of telling firefighters who choose not to have this as a mandatory that somehow they are risking lives. They spent the whole of the pandemic and the lockdowns saving people's lives. We've seen now in Chicago that they've had to have a stay on this actual mandatory vaccinations for police workers. We've got municipal workers and others who are out on the streets and they're going to lose many.
Well, while you're talking, if you don't mind, I want to interrupt, but I don't. But whilst you're talking, I'm going to, because one of the things that I found quite fascinating and that gets very little mention, I notice, on other broadcasters, is just how many protests are taking place at the moment right across the world against a lot of this vaccine mandation. So whilst we're talking, if you don't mind, I am just going to start just showing some of these protests in various different countries. I think the first one I'm going to show is New Zealand. Yeah. Carry on.
Yeah, so, I mean, basically, around the world, people have been protesting. These are, for instance, in New York, you had over 14,000 municipal workers, police officers, first responders. These are all people that have been in the thick of it. Many of them have had COVID. And they've got high immunity. That seems to not be a discussion anymore, with an obsession around this. So the idea that somehow they're being irresponsible or causing a threat to someone is a moot point. It's being ignored. And there's this kind of impulse to threaten and dispense with people that are highly trained and really experienced and can bring enormous value.
This is Australia, by the way. I've got to say, I do think that in some places, some of the authorities have lost the plot. This is Italy, this one. Some of the ways that some of these protesters, etc., have been treated, I find it quite alarming. Well,
interestingly as well, the mayor of Trieste, after we've seen weeks of people bravely coming out in Italy and in Trieste, the port workers and citizens, the mayor suddenly decides to impose a ban and mandatory mask wearing outside for some reason that's got nothing to do with science or anything else, as though somehow you can terrify or threaten people to not execute their democratic rights to say things. It's shocking and outrageous. And actually, it's great that you're showing it here because it's kind of very few places. It's remarkable to me that all around the world these things have been happening and so few of the media broadcast outlets are actually showing it. You know, we've seen the situation where almost like it's like a blanket ban of seeing. Some of them have been remarkable, huge, weekly. If you look at the Gilets Jaunes and have come back out in France, all across Italy. We've seen things in Australia. And, you know, where people have been shot at with rubber bullets and being attacked and things like that. And you just wonder why this doesn't make news, right? And so it's really important that you're showing it. It's also really important that with all of these things, we get to have an open, rigorous discourse and debate about it. And it isn't just threats and then execution of these things without proper parliamentary scrutiny about the efficacy of them and then debate with the public. It's really problematic.
But, you know, the threats are actually worse because now the proposed vaccination schedule to be mandatory for NHS workers is not just the COVID jab, but also the flu jab. I mean, that would have been unthinkable just a couple of years ago.
And Yvonne has got in touch as well, saying everyone, including all those people on the panel with you, Michelle, they would be quite happy for all of these care workers, etc., looking after people with COVID last year without a vaccine and often without no PPE. Now they're essentially, in Yvonne's mind, be treated like criminals. Roy has been in touch saying, I wouldn't put my parents into any home unless all of the staff have been vaccinated. Somebody has also just messaged telling me that they're a care worker and their reasons why, but so many of you are coming in that I've just lost it. I'm going to find it because one of you have definitely messaged in telling me that you're working and explaining, because I did say to Nikki I was going to get someone to do that. Someone will find it for me and I'll read it out in a second. But yeah, I do, and I also find it a bit of a slippery slope, because I think when you start trying to mandate these vaccinations and say, right, you can't do this if you don't have this. There was a company, I'm sure it was in Germany, and I'm sure a viewer will correct me if I'm wrong, that's talking about, for example, having separate canteens for people that are vaccinated and those that are not. And I think, how are we accepting this? How is anyone thinking these things are okay?
Well, that's basically a new form of segregation. We don't want to go anywhere near there. But actually, in response to this story, although I feel strongly that people should have the vaccine, I don't actually believe that you should mandate it. I still believe it should be a choice, because the point is that the minute you say one group of people, however small, have to have it, then you might as well say it for everybody. There's kind of no difference there.
I was just going to throw in as well that if you look at what's happening in Wales, they narrowly got in on a 28 to 27 vote in the Senate with one technical hitch, passing vaccine passports. Now they're discussing rolling them out everywhere else. The idea of a mandatory vaccine ends up becoming, if you use vaccine passports and you need them to access everyday life, to go to venues, to participate, then we have a situation where that's imposed as well. And that's why we actually, I'm a signatory of the togetherdeclaration.org, but basically encouraging the public and others to get engaged and challenging that. But there's going to be a protest on Tuesday where the vote's going to be had at the Senate, and people in Cardiff are going to go there and challenge. But we're faced with the situation, as we know, in Scotland as well. Not only is it really damaging to business, creating a lot of chaos, a loss in revenue, and businesses that already experience an enormous amount of problems, lots of losses, but also the very notion of our ability to move freely, our civil rights, the idea that security or other personnel can say, show me your health papers, the most intimate of our privacy details. And actually, with something that doesn't actually have any health benefits, right? That's the irony. Not that even if it did, I don't think it would be acceptable. But, you know, the whole idea that you have a vaccine passport and then somehow that means that something can't be transmitted or it keeps you safe.
No, but
we've seen is not the case.
You can't say there's no health benefits to having the vaccine. The vaccine has obviously brought down COVID rates in the world.
Vaccine passport.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon.
Yeah, there is a difference. Yeah, and I think, of course, it's clear to say that there is absolutely a vaccine benefit. That's clear to see in terms of hospitalisation rates, hasn't there? But I think the key is, I think the mandates of this is the bit that really get people going. I'm going to take